I think, as Griselda said, that we should start with your comments or questions or thoughts that you may have had around what was said yesterday at the talk. And then I will bring my question to myself and to you, that hopefully you can help me answer, because I have a big question too. But we could, since I said that, turn it around, and at least I just put it there and we leave it. We put it on the table and leave that question here. Go to yours, but I will tell you my question because I evoked it, and so otherwise it becomes this problem of the temporal waiting for that question, I think. My basic question is why I did that talk yesterday. In other words, if most of the Institute and the whole Leverhulme professorship, and actually also the Documenta, was so much about the way in which, through art and artists and their connections with non-artists, such as biologists or people of any walk of life, if so much was about how we can build a world that is flourishing, that has to do with vitality and life together, and so to tell stories so that other stories may open and that refer to that flourishing, that worlding, that I use that word worlding coming from Donna Haraway and other thinkers, not from Heidegger. And therefore, there were so many works in the Documenta, like Pierre Rieg's Untilled, or Christina Buch's Garden for the Butterflies, or Christoph Philipp Müller's growing of different varieties of chard that are becoming extinct because of monocultures and so on. There was so much. There was so much that had to do with coming together with other sentient beings and understanding their ways of understanding the world and making art that somehow is related to that. And this descends also from my personal situated knowledges in Italy, which is arte povera, and the history of arte povera and the thinking of Lucrezio and Heraclito, and this idea of the flow of organicist development of things and the relationships that come again from those situated knowledges which are related to matter and why matter matters. You know, arte povera is all about the transformations of energy in different ways through matters and materials, and the cycling of that and the stories that are born through that cycling. Why did my third lecture focus on something that is tremendously connected with human exceptionalism, or with what the critics of it would call human exceptionalism, which is la condition humaine, you know, the human condition of bearing witness and of experiencing traumatic events or war or catastrophe or collapse or destruction that is then vehicled or introduced into the works that often are then more filmic than the other works we've looked at. You know, we have 4 videos to look at. So it carries you to a certain medium even, away from other medium, maybe a little bit less into sculpture and more into video. You know, why did I do that? Because it's what at school the teacher would say is fuori tema, outside of the subject. You know, wrong. You didn't answer the subject. It's not on the topic. I'm not going to read your paper. So this is like a mistake in a way within an overall seminar. And what we did until now didn't really necessarily lead up to this, necessarily. So the same thing happens in the Documenta itself. In that exhibition, it was so important to me to have Dinculi's work, to have so many pieces, William Kentridge's work, you know, to have so many artworks that did deal also with collapse and recovery, destruction, and the memory of traumatic events, how to elaborate them. I mean, Avery Gordon did one of the notebooks. Many artists went to visit Breitenau, that had been a concentration camp during the Nazi period, a few kilometers outside of Kassel. And, you know, why was there that, and why is there this? So that's my question, you know, how does it connect, if it connects in any way, and why would it need to connect? Is it, I mean, my instinct is that it's a way to avoid a kind of cliche environmentalist exhibition. You know, I like, let's do an exhibition about ecology and the human in this wonderful universe of co-flourishing with sustainability. But I'm not sure, you know, I really don't know exactly. So that's my question. And
okay, but does that relate to the four positions you chose? In one sense, that also structured the show. You know,
could
retreat,
you elaborate?
I can't remember, retreat.
Siege, retreat,
yeah.
Hope, and stage. What does it mean for an artist, or for any person for that matter, to feel and be on stage?
Yeah.
What do they do when you're in a state of performativity? When you're going to the Biennale of God knows where and you're going to do it?
Yeah.
What do you do when you're in a state of hope? The fact that all the Egyptian artists wouldn't answer the phone. When I was working on the Documenta, in like 6 months, they were so busy with the revolution.
Right.
They just, Documenta was the last thing on their mind, you know, for Weil Schauke. He was organizing the whole universe, he thought. And it reminded me of the early 20th century, of Malevich stopping to paint and starting to make cups and put a contribution to the revolution. So being in a state of hope often is a state in which artists or intellectuals will sort of set aside what they feel to be a very personal research. And somehow the other was retreat. Well, we spoke about retreat yesterday.
Exactly. I mean,
and withdraw. And what was the other? Siege. Yeah. What does it mean to be besieged? To be in Afghanistan and be a writer, a poet, an artist right now, and what meaning is it to what can you do when you're under siege? Like Beckmann in Amsterdam, after fleeing Germany and painting the triptychs, which somehow Beckmann's triptychs are a spatial breakage of perspective through these 3 panels that make it impossible to find a focal point that somehow unifies your image. So the being under siege brought to a breakage of the spatial organization of the paintings in a way, with these incredible triptychs like Perseus. Yeah, so what does an artist do? So, and what do you mean by that?
I was just thinking, you asked yourself the question why, and yet you'd set yourself those positions which allowed you to think about witnessing and to think about other things other than or to think about matter. You're still thinking about matter in a way, aren't you?
Yes. Surely matter matter and technology, I would say. Matter transformed into technique, into techne, to use the Greek, to see the internet, to see the cloud as a bunch of matter in a desert in the United States of America, somewhere. To see behind this idea of the cloud being up in the sky somewhere. And to see, I remember this is interesting that you say this. What I like about these institutes is that we have time, so we don't have to be afraid like in a lecture. But just a small story that comes to my mind. The other day I was in the countryside outside of Rome, and the internet had not worked for years, but I decided to reopen this house. It's like in the waves of Virginia Woolf. I thought this house should be cleaned and open, and nobody had been there for many years because of a death of someone. And the internet wasn't working, and I don't have an internet technician out in the countryside, but there is a man who comes and helps the olives, prunes the trees, and does the planting of the vegetable garden, and he comes once a week. And I asked him if he had any idea who could help, and he said, well, I'm going to try. And I said, okay. And Stefano the next day came with his modem from his home. And I said, why did you bring your modem? He said, well, because the first thing I want to understand is if it works, or if it's a problem of the communication provider. So I thought if I plug in my modem, we'll check that. So he plugged in his modem and it worked. So that was not the problem. So then, no, he plugged in his modem and it didn't work. And I said, okay, so we have to call the telecom. He said, no, now we're going to unplug all the phones in the house and see if it works. Because it could be some other thing that influences. This is a man who is expert in growing and plants and taking care of how to not use a lot of pesticides, but a kind of grassroots knowledge of this, not from a university bioagriculture degree. And so we unplugged all the phones and it worked. Then he plugged in the phones downstairs and it worked with his modem. Then he plugged in the phone that was upstairs in the same room where the internet modem was, and it didn't work. So then we knew that it had something to do with this thing. So we didn't plug it in and we put back the modem and it didn't work, my modem. And then he fiddled with it and at the end it worked. And the last thing he said to me was, but in any case, it might work a little bit and not also a little bit not. Because these things are not black or white, you know. This is copper. I said, what? He said, it's copper. You know, in these wires, it has to go through all the land here and then goes through the trees. This is not like in a city, you know. So copper gets consumed. Copper gets consumed. You know, that a wire, how does the copper get consumed? That because of the use of the wire. It does, evidently. I hadn't thought of that. I suppose that in the impulses that go through with the information, there's electrons that are being challenged by others, and there's reaggregation, so the actual material decays. So that is something that could be a connection, but I don't know what. But it certainly was an experience that made me think how a farmer fixes the internet through a logical procedure, a very intelligent procedure that combines an understanding that everything is matter, that even a thought is matter, that when we think, or when you interview those people, the Viet Cong artists, and they talk, there's particles, subatomic particles that are passing, that are constituted into thoughts, and that then become the thoughts in someone else's mind. So that's one connection, I suppose, to why matter matters. So to look at these videos, what we could do is look at them with, maybe it's a question of how we look at them. So to look at history, not as an abstract history, but to look at what is in the room in this, to imagine what they're talking about in terms of being embodied maybe in the jungle. You know, when we were looking at that drawing, how can you draw that if you haven't had the proprioceptive experience of hiding in reeds, you know? You can't. So and we always say that drawing is about looking, you know, the ability to look. So you learn to draw and you draw something so that you're looking at it in a slow way. But it's not only about looking, it's also about the proprioceptive knowledge which is coming from the whole body in a certain context. Maybe. Is that what you're saying, Alison?
Yeah, probably. I mean, your description of the way that the farmer approached that problem is also the way that an artist would approach that problem, or people that I'm around would have done exactly the same thing. I would have done exactly the same thing, checked all the plugs, pulled them all out and whatever.
What is an artist?
Who
is an artist?
Well, who is an artist? Precisely, the kind of people that I associate with who have trained as artists would tend to take that approach as well.
A kind of material, empirical.
Yeah.
Problem solving through empirical.
Through just trying things out, first. Trying out the material things first.
What also intrigued me about his way was that it was to think about Whitehead again and organicism and Deleuze, it was a very it was not rhizomatic. It was not, there's nodes everywhere, everything is connected with everything. It was more like a branching out, you know, taking a broad thing and then seeing the branches, and then this one seeing the branches, and then that seeing the branches. So it's a quite different vision than a Deleuzian vision, but it comes from the same organicist idea of branchings and graftings.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're saying?
I don't know, probably.
Right. But anyway, so to go to yeah, we can.
Well, yeah, I do have a question.
Yes, let's go to your reactions and questions, and
Okay.
we can leave that one.
What occurred to me yesterday while you were giving your lecture was that I'm thinking, if we just take that women are, generally speaking, invisible, so they should be trustworthy and reliable witnesses. However, our kind of testimony isn't credible because while no one acknowledges us, while no one acknowledges seeing us witness, then no one hears our story when we try to tell it. So we're there, invisible, witnessing, but because we're invisible and no one sees us, no one acknowledges seeing us witnessing, then when we try to tell this story, no one hears it because they didn't see us witnessing it. And I was wondering whether there were artists that you included in the documenta that addressed that.
Okay, well, there were many women artists. One,
Yes,
I must say that it was the documenta with more women than in any other previous documenta.
Yes.
But I didn't, that's not answering your question at all. It's just, not at all, but it's just to say that there's a lot of people I have to run through my head right now.
Yes.
The question, before answering it though, it provokes something in me. Your question provokes something, which is, who is no one? Who is no one? I mean, when you're saying no one sees, you're giving a lot of power to the male gaze,
Yes.
that might create this invisibility, and suggesting that it might still be a legitimizing gaze.
Yes.
And so I was having a reaction saying, but that's not, you know, why no one? You know, who is this no one? Who is this king? Who is this patriarch who gets to say that something is visible or invisible? I think there were many perspectives onto the world by women artists in the documenta that were absolutely visible and absolutely told their stories. To the degree, so I mean, I can think about so many, like from Sanja Ivekovic, for example. She, to the degree, what I'm saying is to the degree that often the question of invisibility is adopted by those artists beyond the question of the woman. In other words, Sanja Ivekovic did work around the invisibility of the prisoners in Breitenau during the war. So political prisoners, Jewish people who were thrown there and so on, by making a series of posters that listed on them around the city, they were all over the city, the reasons for internment in Breitenau. So, because she didn't want to work, because he replied badly, because, so, and these list of reasons, these 200 reasons were very visible. They were like all over the damn city, and Secondly, however, she also made an installation, I'll pull out the picture now, in the Neue Galerie, where you saw a vitrine with all these toy donkeys, like small stuffed animals. And each one had a name, and the name was someone who had been killed for political reasons, assassinated, an anarchist or whatever, a revolutionary of one sort or another. She got those names through an open kind of call to all the participants of the Documenta, all the artists of the Documenta and curators, agents, got this request, you know, who comes to your mind if you think about political assassinations of people who were socially engaged and politically engaged? And so she got this big pot of maybe 800 names that are also a portrait of the participants, because they will of course be names of people from certain parts of the world and certain ages and so on. And then she allocated them to these donkeys. Now the donkey, speaking about invisibility and what I was just trying to answer, which connects again with worlding, because I think that most of the women artists who were in the Documenta do not, except for maybe, I mean, there were a few very direct cases that have to do with the condition of women. Thinking of the project that Avery Gordon did together with the German artist. I'll get it right now. But most of them, I think, live and practice as artists, and this is probably reflecting something about me and the curators, because you can find just as many who don't have that attitude, but most of them live and work as artists without focusing on the question of the invisibility of the woman right now, but feel a visibility and feel a need, a political need to embrace a broader or other invisibilities. So, for example, Sanja Ivekovic, why the donkeys, you know? Why the donkeys? Well, because she's from Croatia, and there is a very crucial and urgent problem of the extinction of donkeys in Europe right now. Because donkeys were used to carry weight, heavy loads, and now trucks carry weight and heavy loads, and donkeys are considered stubborn because they don't do things. Sometimes they stop, and they're considered stupid and stubborn. Actually, animal zoologists and so on who know donkeys realize, and other species realize, that they're amongst the most reasonable and processing and intelligent animals, very close to dolphins and humans. And the reason they stop and don't do things is because they need to understand why. You know, there's got to be a damn good reason for doing this thing. So these very intelligent animals, considered stupid, Dummkopf, donkeys, also traditionally, are becoming extinct, and because you have to feed them, you have to do a lot, you have to live with, you have to share the world with them. It's not like you just park your truck and then put gas in it if you have the money and you need the truck this week and you don't need it last week. So she visited a donkey farm that is existing in Croatia to protect the donkeys. So if you have donkeys, instead of killing them, you can bring them to this donkey farm where they let them live free on this land, and it's to encourage reproduction and so on. And that was the reason behind having these toy donkeys, actually. So she's bringing together, in that case, and she took me to this donkey farm, this other question of invisibility, you know, the invisibility of all these species that we share the world with and that are being eliminated and eradicated because they're not economically viable. I'm not speaking about species being eliminated through pollution and just the collapse of biosystems, but the donkey is, like the dog, a cultural, it's part of very human culture, you know, like a peach is, you know, so there wouldn't be donkeys unless people kind of decided to, I mean, am I speaking of the mule or the donkey? So you take a horse and you take a and you get a
That's a mule.
a mule. Yeah, it depends. Yeah, it depends. But yeah, it depends. Exactly. Everything is always gray. There are always gray zones. Always gray zones. So what I mean to say is, as most of the so-called nature and most of the so-called culture, there's all these interactions that are happening. And so she was particularly focusing on that kind of invisibility. She also did refer, however, in those lines, no, she didn't. But she studied very much the Breitenau, this prison outside of Kassel, as it became a girls' reformatory in the 1950s, when the city was being cleaned up in order to prepare for things like Documenta to happen. The city, well, all over, you know the situation in Ireland of the girls' reformatories and so on, or the situation in Australia, taking away children from mothers and so on. So there are situations all over the world like this, but also in Germany in the 50s, there was this cleaning up by making these reformatories for people who did not commit any crimes, but are just antisocial behavior. And Ulrike Meinhof, the Bader-Meinhof person who then died in prison, as we know, was suicided. She had done her last news report as a journalist on the girls' reformatories and had visited Breitenau outside of Kassel for the German television, which then was not screened because of the liberation of Bader had happened 2 or 3 weeks before the scheduled screening of this news report went on German television, so it never was screened, and it exists as a radio recording, and it exists as a book. And anyway, that was very interesting also to Sanya, and it was interesting also to other artists. So that sort of answers your question, I guess. I mean, the main point is that there was no focus on the invisibility of women as a topic, general topic, but there were some incursions of that question. But there was mostly artists, like I was about to mention, the other people who are here know her work quite well because we looked at it. I was about to mention Christina Buch. She was one of the women artists who, more than the male artists, I must say, have this sense of expanding the we and addressing the question of the invisibility also of non-human sentient beings and their agencies and their civilizations or cultures and so on. And so what she did was create a piece that was rather invisible to most of the audience, human audience, but was very visible to the butterflies, which was a butterfly garden right in front of Friedrichianum, where you would normally place a monument, a equestrian monument or something in the Friedrichsplatz, the center of the whole exhibition traditionally considered. And it was rather invisible because for humans these plants don't mean much, but to the butterflies they do. Oh wait, sorry. Because she studied biology before studying art with Rosemary Truckle, she studied theology and biology. And in her biological studies, through her knowledge of that, she was able to study well what is the food that butterflies of the region of Kassel like, what kind of plants and flowers. So it was a very high concentration of the plants and flowers that during those months would be attractive to butterflies. And what's interesting is that the photographs that Christina Buch made are not artworks. She doesn't see them at artworks, but since we were talking about witnessing, they are documentation of that garden, and I think she took them from rather close up, and sometimes from the perspective a butterfly might have, just to see how the butterfly would see the plants. So this, to me, is speaking about invisibility for sure, but it's claiming the space of invisibility, which connects with yesterday's topic of the retreat and withdrawal as a place of potential agency, political agency, aesthetic agency, rather than as a place of decadent aesthetic retreat from the world. So this invisible project, not documented much in the media at all, and not even seen much, not only by men, not even seen much by women who are visiting the Documenta, is surely speaking about the potential in invisibility. She's very young. She was the youngest artist in the Documenta. So, Christina Buch.
Was she younger than Chiara?
Yes. Well, how old is Chiara? For my...
12, 13.
Well, she's 11. Christina's 11.
She's 21, 22?
No, she's not 21. She said that? Chiara for me?
I just thought she was 21.
No, I think Chiara is like 30 and Christina is 28, or 26 and 24, or 12 and 11. We can figure it out. But it's interesting that this segues in back to the previous seminars from the one of yesterday. So we can connect the question of retreat and withdrawal with the question of invisibility, seen not as a lack of something, but a lack as a potential, you know. So to not see things in Lacanian ways, in other words, to not see this question of desire as some sort of fundamental lack of the petit objet to see that as a more patriarchal way of understanding desire, maybe. And to see this invisibility and this lack as actually a very full space, a very full space. That relates to the Documenta notebook by Karen Barad that we read, I think, about how full the invisible space is. Is that in this reading of this week? Yeah, it could have been, because so I'm just going to run through these and then show you the other two projects that I mentioned. Now, if you see it from to start to look at this from the inside of the piece, which is, and close-ups, is the perspective of the butterflies. So it's artwork made for butterflies. She, in the Documenta Halle, also, every day that she liberated some butterflies in her garden, because not only were butterflies coming just not spontaneously, she was also rearing, how do you say, growing butterflies in her apartment. So every time that one would be born and be released into the garden, she would put them with pins in the museum. So again, it's of course a reference to, not the Hottentot Venus, but it's a reference to two opposite things. I mean, you never get any conclusion with me. I just don't know how to make any conclusive point. What you see here is two kind of opposite things. On one hand, the horror of the traditional scientific method of killing things to put a pin in them and to classify them and archive them. But you also see a world of science that's kind of the past, that is testimony or witness to that being out in the field, which was, you know, the getting of the butterflies and so on. So there you see the garden from the outside, and you see how unspectacular it was. So it was rather invisible and uninteresting to people. You know, nobody stopped particularly. Okay, so that is speaking about one artist who surely comes from feminist perspectives. I mean, if you look at other works that we've seen together, like the one with the fish and the killing of the fish and the breast and so on, but sees this invisibility as a space of potentiality and sees the question of bringing to visibility certain topics as expanded from the direct one concerning women's stories. I mean, these are the stories of the butterflies also of the region. I mean, if you were to focus on that work, you learn about this whole ecosystem, and it's quite invisible. The other one that we that we mentioned, what was it, Sanya? Well, that's not the poster in the street, but this is the donkeys that I was mentioning with the names of the politically assassinated people. So it referred to two questions. One, the fact that these donkeys currently today are becoming extinct in Europe because they are trash of a period preceding economy. And two, they referred to this photograph of that was published in a German newspaper during the early 40s. And it was an event done in Friedrichsplatz, in the same square where the butterfly garden is, where the Nazis put a barbed wire and a donkey. It was an anti-Semitic event where they wanted to say that if you are Germans, non-Jewish Germans, who help Jews, you are stupid, like a donkey. That's what the texts were in the newspaper and this. And so they did this collective event and this is how you're going to be treated by us. So the donkey was the stupid German non-Jewish who doesn't understand how evil it is to support the Jewish people. And the irony of this is that the donkey, as we just mentioned, is one of the most intelligent animals known to humans at present. With all the neuroscientific testing of them, it's quite evident. So it's a kind of return of the traumatic that is also a historical reversal of the idea, kind of ironic undercutting of the idea why the Nazis used that. Yes, of course. Chiara Fumai would be one of the cases where there was a direct reference by a younger artist. But who is the artist who was together with Avery Gordon? We'll look it up, yeah. Because I have a gap. She's a wonderful German artist that I was about to talk to you about a second ago. But while we're finding out about her, Chiara Fumai is an Italian young artist, and she spoke in her work to the question of the hysteric, and she created an installation and a performance that she repeated very often throughout the documenta, where she was kind of enacting the voice of a witch, criticizing Hegel and Hegel's view of history and women and all. So this house of the hysteric was indeed a case of a very direct work, but not about invisibility. It was not about the invisibility of the story, of the other stories. It was really a celebration of the space of the hysteric. Yeah. So this is the inside of the house. Griselda, do you want to, you saw the performance, of course, I think, and her voice was very interesting because she also brought that together with the ghostly and the spectral voice. So all of the feminist writings around the ghostly, and as an undercurrent of modernity, even in the Enlightenment period, where the Gothic novels written by women, Anne Radcliffe and other women, Castle of Otranto and so on. So she brought in this question of the space of the specter and the ghost, which is neither, well, which undermines the idea of a binary world and the Cartesian cut between mind and matter. I mean, yeah, mind and matter, because the ghost, being somehow material, materic, and also immaterial, somehow alive and somehow dead, somehow stuck in between life and death, and somehow proof of this gray zone that is in between. And she knew that I was very interested in quantum physics, and so all the questions around entanglement as a force, where for example, photons that are entangled will be reacting in a harmonious way, even if they are very far. Like one can be on one side of the planet and one can be on another side of the planet. But if they've been entangled, which means that they've been in contact, you can produce entanglement in the lab by splitting a photon. For example, if you take a photon, if you take a laser beam and you shoot it through, that's okay, you just entangled this floor with it. I mean, so some people are still dubious of quantum physics and the force of entanglement, but very few are. I mean, if you study a little bit of physics, you know that that's the case. So if you take a photon and split it, and it becomes two photons, they're entangled. They can be entangled in terms of color, in terms of direction, in terms of movement. So for example, if they're in terms of direction, if one does this and the other one does that, and then this does this, that one will do that. And it's on the basis of entanglement that quantum computing is being developed for the future, because there will be no transmission of information going. There will be only a modification of things at one terminal that causes the modification at the other terminal, and therefore there's a sort of teleported, but it's not really teleported, it's harmonious communication, like telepathy, sort of. So she knew that I was all into my readings about teleportation and quantum entanglement, and this is fantastic, and Anton Zellinger coming. And so I think she connected it also with this idea of the ghostly and this unexplicable relations that things have in the world, and that have always been relegated to the space of the witch. And so her critique of Hegel was also through this voice of the hysteric and the ghostly. Griselda, do you wish to add anything?
Well, I didn't see her performance there. I've seen her perform elsewhere, but it seems because of her relationship to the figure of Carla Lonzi, who was the sort of founder of Italian radical feminism.
Yes, I forgot.
This piece called Let's Spit on Hegel is one of the great pieces of Italian sort of feminist polemic, the like of which none of us would dare ever to do in the nice, polite world that we sort of please don't be too upset if we mention something. And I mean, she will do this in her persona. So I've seen her perform. Sure. We did a Carla Lonzi day, and it's quite electrifying because she has such a incredible
power
of her voice and her presence as she
that comes from this low area in a way, not high.
Yeah, it's very, and I think she's very, so the figure in that was a kind of conflation, because I'm not sure she hadn't been an African woman at this figure she drew, so she performed in this great wig, and then she sort of speaks these texts, so it's relating to what you're saying, that the kind of enormous force of a way of speaking absolutely forces the listeners and spectators to become witnesses to it's not the invisible, but the unheard that's associated with this. So I think that's why I was just picking up.
Yes, it's very important to mention Chiara. Indeed, I had also forgotten the main point, which is that most of the text that she uses in this performance is from the Carla Lonzi work contro Hegel. Who was one of the founders of Rivolta Femminile in the early 70s, and Carla Lonzi left art to found Rivolta Femminile. So there's a big polemic within the Italian art world amongst women artists about Carla Lonzi, because although she's admired, loved, she's also considered like, I mean, it's a problem, because Carla Lonzi said in 1969, art is patriarchal, punto. Art was invented by men, for men, and it is not you cannot just change art. You have to stop making it. It is a production. You put out another piece of production. You know, you make an artwork and you put it into the world. And this idea of making something and putting it into the world. Now, she asked Carla Accardi, the most important woman artist of Italy, I think, or to my view, that alive today, because she was a founder of an art movement in 1940. Oh no, she died 2 months ago. I went to her funeral. Yeah, that's true. I went to her funeral, but she was alive till 2 months ago. And Carla Carla Accardi founded a movement called Forma Uno in 1947, you know, so it's like quite old woman. Carla Accardi, I remember conversations about Carla Lonzi. They were quite close friends, and then they broke and never saw each other again because, well, they saw each other, but just politely. Because Carla Accardi told me that Carla Lonzi told her to stop painting. You know, you had to stop. So there was a big break, and Carla Lonzi was one of the most exquisite art critics of Italy. She is the first person to write about arte povera before Germano Celant, 10 years before. She was writing reviews of Mario Mertz's exhibition in 1958. You know, Celant wasn't even at college at that time. He was young, and he only meets them around 64. And Carla Lonzi wrote the first text interview with Cunellis and the first text about Paolini. And she would do these interviews, and what she did mainly, which was really important to at least Italian art history writing and art writing, is that she was thinking about Marshall McLuhan and the question of being in this era of the radio and of the acoustic voice. And she thought that it was politically, she was a communist, and she thought that it was wrong that people would interview artists and then use the words of the artists and write an essay as if it was coming from their brain, you know, that they just knew everything because they had looked at the artwork and figured it all out. So she thought that their art critic or art historian had to be implicated in the process of knowing of the work. All the hesitations, all the questions, all the doubts, all the misunderstandings had to be present. So she published, to my knowledge, the first interviews that exist with living artists, which she published in a magazine in the late 50s, the first ones, mid to late 50s, called, well, it'll come back too, this name. And then she discussed it and theorized it as that the space of the writing had to be this dialogic space of the conversation, keeping the hesitations and so on. Now, as we all know, things that are a little bit revolutionary, they sometimes become dominant and paradigmatic, and at that point, somehow it's a problem. So now the interview is, all you do is you do the interviews. You know, there's like nobody who wants to sit down, very few people sit down and write the essay because it's so easy, and it's this sort of reality TV thing in this moment. So things are very different. But at that time, the voice, the vulnerability of the voice of the art historian or art critic was not present in this power relation going on. So she did that. Then after so much wonderful work that she had written about art, for example, for me, a very important thing that Carla Lonzi did was she taught me of the connection between abstract expressionism, informel, and arte povera. I always thought that it was against, that arte povera was somehow conceptual art against the previous generation, which was abstract expressionist, heroic, and blah, 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 Jackson Pollock. Actually, in reading those early reviews of the exhibition, I understand that Mario Merz was interested in this idea of the flow of the painting and the importance of the matter of the Cobra artists, the abstract expressionist, the dripping of the Helen Frankenthaler, and so on, plus the influence of Gutai, actions in paint, were very important to them, and they saw in between something that they went against, which was pop art and kinetic art, programmed Marxist art about the multiple and about the machine, art as a machine, the cybernetic not the organic part of cybernetics, but the machine. So they went against what was going on between 64, 65, and in the late 50s, and so she wrote that. But anyway, it doesn't matter. To go back to Chiara Fumai, so when Carla Lonzi refuses art and stops to be an art critic, she doesn't pick up her pen and talk about art until 84. And in 1984, she writes about art again for Identità Italiana. But you've done a whole seminar on Carla Lonzi, so I'm going to pass the baton back over there. But it just comes to my mind that Chiara Fumai's work is so complex because it's the return of a celebration of Carla Lonzi after many years in which the art world didn't really celebrate her, not even women artists in Italy, because of her rejection of art. But I understand, and I think Chiara Fumai understands, that what she was rejecting was the canonical art historical definition of art and the patriarchal history and she didn't imagine that there could be a breakage of that and another story. I mean, that didn't come to Carla Lonzi. So what she was against was that Winkelmann idea of art. So it's very interesting that Chiara Fumai brings her back into our world strongly.
Maybe, do you want to come back a little bit and say more about what it was that...
But one last thing about Chiara was this performance that you see in this picture was not that one about Hegel and Carla Lonzi. This was a performance on the roof of the Fridericianum. She did 2 or 3 times during the exhibition where she was blowing fire, onto these sculptures on this roof, and speaking.
There's a little bit on YouTube of the...
Oh, good. But am I on the internet?
We'll just go on to this one.
So, but let's first go back.
Could you say more about what it was, where your question was coming from?
Yes.
It was, you provoked a very interesting sort of sense of it. Clearly there's a deep...
But then there's the third artist I need to bring then, because this was the most direct related to invisibility of women.
Well, just hold on.
Okay.
I suppose you have really begun to address it. I was trying to find out if there were artists that you felt made efficient use of invisibility, made efficient use of being able to be somewhere where they are, where nobody notices what they're doing.
Yes.
Because there are more important things going on. There are guns going off, or there are cameras being pointed, or there are mountains being climbed, or these very sort of newsworthy things. And I think you've begun really to
That's very interesting because it does connect to yesterday in trying
Yes.
to understand the relation between witnessing and retreat.
Yes.
Not wanting to give a talk about witnessing. Because if you give a talk about witnessing, of course you can put Rabim Rouet and Dinkuli and Francis Alice videos that we'll look at. You can put them all, and it will be a kind of one-liner about the embodied artist engaged in a place politically, witnessing it, creating an artwork where he brings testimony of that, for example, dominant media doesn't give. Okay, so that's one little tight, clean story.
Yeah.
But the question to bring witnessing together with retreat, so to use another word, instead of retreat, to use invisibility or to connect invisibility with retreat is surely a good way of explaining maybe why I felt, because I don't know why I wanted to bring in retreat with witnessing clearly. I felt that, we discussed some of it yesterday during the lecture, but I think this is an interesting way to go, to bring it towards this question of a fruitful use of invisibility.
Let's just watch a little bit of this, and then you can talk about the third part.
Yes.
It's a bipolar exhibition. And it is a from the 19th century, and then another trick called Mise Dalmaga. And she didn't have any special abnormality or special skill, but the fact is that she was a very, I would say, rather common girl, even if common is actually not a compliment, wearing a very, very strange wig. It was all like a fictional character, created by her very strange. Zalumagra wasn't representing an identity, the non-identity. So she wasn't the wife, she wasn't the mother, she wasn't the daughter, neither the prostitute, nothing. When Zalumagra was presented for the first time in the Barbon Fair show, she was asked to avoid using words. And this is what she never spoke for more or less 150 years. So I thought it might have been a very good idea to take this woman and bring her, take her into my show and then make her speak.
The conflict, therefore, is not between females and males, but between scum, dominant, secure, self-confident, nasty, violent, selfish, independent, proud, thrill-seeking, freewheeling, arrogant females.
Ines Chabert.
To call a man an animal
interrupted.
is to flatter
She's older,
him.
she's 70 again.
Is a machine, a walking dildo. Niceness, politeness and dignity, money, marriage, and prostitution, and becomes a transvestite. He loses his desire to screw or to do anything else, for that matter, double dealers. He fulfills himself as a drag queen and gets his dick chopped off. He then achieves a continuous diffuse sexual feeling from being a woman. Screwing is, for a man, a defense against his desire to.
So you can follow those up elsewhere, but she's making, bringing up these and embodying again these voices and speeches again, or silenced women or silent things of the kind that is much more in a sort of a visible tradition of a certain kind of feminist witnessing compared to what you were exploring it that way. So you want to go back to yours?
Yes, I'll do that. And then
Okay.
I wanted to bring just a moment, and while looking for Ines Chabert, I came across a ton of things that have to do with invisibility and retreat and the potential in that, which is somehow not just, for example, not at all just by women artists, but also Cevdet Erek, the emptying out of the shopping center and the putting of the sound in the shopping mall was incredibly about the power of this invisibility and retreat. But now the first is to show you Ines Chabert. So together with Avery Gordon, they did a very interesting research project on Breitenau during the period in which it was a girls' reformatory. And in the 1950s, and turned then into a, oh, no. I hope I can get the pictures of it for you. But it was just there, well, all you see is the curtain, but it's interesting because, so behind the curtain are a series of monitors and pieces that are collaged together through this research around this monastery when it was girls' reformatory. And now there is a whole compensation discussion going on in Germany towards women who have been abused by being interned there during those years. And this, so they're behind, they put the curtain, which is along a street. In other words, this is a vitrine of an ex-shop. So in a way, this invisibility is also related to the way that the curtain hides also the installation which is behind it, so that from the street, you can't actually see. It's not much of a picture, unfortunately, but that was another piece that was very directly about the invisibility of these women in the 50s. And even today, the embarrassment or polemics in the local government and difficulty for them to do the research around Breitenau at that time. But I also, speaking about invisibility, would like to show you these pictures of, this is a shopping center that is a part of another, so you had to, it was adjacent to the shopping center that was full of clothes. And Cevdet Erek created this beautiful sound installation that is really a marking. It's a CNA shopping center, you see? The mark outside, which has to do with the, well, rendering invisible. This is an action of making invisibility and making space, you know, removing all of the goods that would be there in the aisles. So that was clearly connected to one of the four positions. I mean, this question of retreat and withdrawal was very interesting because you walked through the shopping center with all the goods that were on sale, and then you walked into this wing of it, and suddenly it was this huge void. You know, it's an incredible void. Another question of celebration of invisibility was Renata Lucas's Invisible Pyramid that I will show you a picture of in a second. We can see here. No, it sounds right. It sounds like what it was. What you were hearing was time and space being constructed through the rhythm of certain beats as you moved through the shopping mall. And there was just this sign on the outside, big sign, saying, "Last decade, a documenta changed my life," which was let's say the spectacle, the surface. And that's the shopping center that you walk through to get to the piece. And you walk through this corridor, and we basically borrowed a section of the shopping center. And you walked through all that stuff, and then you ended up.
So how did you make them agree on?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
They did it? Or
Yes.
did you have to pay them, or is, you know?
I think we paid them a little bit of rent, but it was very little. It was not so much. They wanted to be part of the documenta. Oh, he's looking. Well, there were some small objects that have to do with rhythm and that are kind of a code to understand what was going on. That's the back of that sign. That,
So I remember seeing a sign.
but you didn't
And
go
then I
in.
saw the other side.
Oh. It was a very strong, shocking experience of the voiding of consumer culture. Very beautiful, very liberating. So that was that one. I had
A question
pen.
in terms of visibility and non-visibility.
Yes.
There's often the term used of emerging, you know, when you talk about becoming visible. So yesterday you talked about shrinking and the miniaturization
Yes.
of things.
Yes, I didn't
So I was
use
just
visible.
wondering, you know,
Yes.
are there any artworks that would be, you know, representative or very, very good examples of that?
Walid Rad, he
Kind
did a
of,
whole
you know.
retrospective in the big as this table, but that I spoke about. But that's very interesting question. the use of the word visible and invisible, which is a very important word in the history of, like, for example, Inside the Visible and so on, history of exhibitions and feminist history, what is visible and what is not as visible. For me, I don't really use that word for the reason that I explained, which is, of course it's visible, it depends by who, you know, and then this primacy of the eye over all the other senses. So I don't want to focus on vision only. So I don't want to make a battle with the language of the oppressor, let's say. So I speak about retreat and withdrawal and not visible or invisibility, to claim that space as a space of potential action. And I sometimes use the word secret. You know, the secrets of Al-Shahiz are one of the notebooks of the Documenta that Daniel Heller-Rosen. And I rarely use the word shrinking, but I used it yesterday in reference to Walid Rad's work, because he does that. He says that history, and as Griselda says, obviously, and as all of us say, is a terrain of contestation, of course, and one can make histories and remake histories and find histories that were lost, or give space to histories, you know, to shape and that as a sculpture of cultural memories, to make more space for this, to be engaged in creating certain histories. So he, in his piece, scratching on things that I would disavow or whatever, was the exact title. He speaks of the current history of the Arab world in art, and he speaks of this intentional shrinking of certain histories that is going on through the intentional and planned at the table expansion of certain other stories that are being constructed through, for example, the programming of exhibitions in maybe certain Gulf region museums, for example, or the planning for what's going to be in the collection and what not, and so on. And what Walid is denouncing in that piece that we looked at, that slide, is that certain stories, certain artists and their stories and their work have shrunk, basically. This is connected with Jalal Toufik's writings, that is friend of Walid, maybe very, very close friend, maybe so close that you can't even imagine how close he is. I'm not speaking about his private life at all, but the story of Jalal Toufik is a real mystery to me. Anyway, Jalal Toufik / Walid Rad, and Jalal is a person. You can have lunch with Jalal too and talk to him. But Jalal Toufik, who is a person, and he's an intellectual and writes and publishes, is very close to Walid. And he wrote about this shrinking of cultures, how they can be withdrawn, but not withdrawn intentionally by the subject who withdraws, but they can be made smaller. So not only is there light to be shed on things that have not had light, but there's situations where things that were part of the patrimoine culturel, say, can be wiped out, obviously, it can be shrunk. So that's why he did his, he on these walls, you have these small pictures on the walls. That's a whole history of Arab art that has been shrunk. You see, what you see on the walls is basically a history of 20th century Arab art that has been disappeared. You know how you mentioned, Griselda, that Vasari talks about certain women artists and so on, that it's a simplistic narrative to say that suddenly women artists are discovered in the 20th century and everything is dandy now, while they were oppressed and invisible before. And you remind us that some things had become shrunk, had been withdrawn, actually, that were more present. It seems that Walid's interpretation of contemporary Arab culture would be the same. You know, if you think about the 20th century and what was going on in terms of international relations and global relations between painters, poets, writers, all across the world, from India, Paris, Africa, and the Arab world, which then suddenly disappeared in this superficial and wrong story of now, after 1989, we can know the Arab world and we can let the Arab artists into the official history of art. Has nothing to do with what was going on between Cairo and Beirut and Baghdad and Tehran in the 1950s, you know, or 40s or 30s or 20s or 60s. And so that is, I think, what he meant by things can get shrunk. And so as a sort of paradox of the shrinking, these walls, by the way, are references to a flat museum. So they are like digital drawings of space that doesn't really exist because it's flattened. So it's almost saying that the Abu Dhabi museums don't really exist. They are big storages. He's done beautiful photographs of the storages, and they will be flat somehow. They are a flat story. The question of the surface.
But this does relate, I think, very
very closely.
What I know of Levena's work and indeed the position that has been taken, particularly in more Sorter's writing, this statement, there have always been black women artists, and why it's such an important statement. But it's interesting because Sharon Opitz-Mar, who has come to some of the ones before, it's exactly what she's finding in her research on the writing of Turkish history of art, which writes a story of Turkish art becoming Turkish international art by virtue of its intersection with the things that guarantee your participation in somebody else's story, to the point exactly of losing what Gerardo Mosquera has insisted is the invisibility of the conversations amongst all the non-allied nations and all the decolonizing countries. I mean, even in the 20th century, it came up, I think, a little bit in the video about the Viet Cong artists.
Yes.
Because you have this, conversation, Uncle Ho met Picasso in Paris. It's rather like, when I was reading about Melanie Malini, and she was saying, well, then I bumped into, Yasser Arafat in Paris in 1961, and I thought, here, these other, this is on the political scale, the conversation, or even when the exhibition of Salvador Shaker at the Tate. But that we discovered that, her point of view was that she studied with Léger in Paris, but she was also really walking around Cairo, looking at architecture, and exactly what she was producing was this other set of axes, which are rendered unintelligible to the models that those flat museums will put up in their sequencing, because you can't create that image of the entanglement or networking or conversations through the linear movement that is the sort of the central feature of the museum. So it's kind of, in one sense, this is so interesting. What would be the form in which people could get a different sense of conversation connectivity that would precisely shift from, as you say, the sudden discovery. Or now we've got international artists in which people are forced onto the stage to perform a kind of geo-ethnic ethnicity rather than to give rise to an understanding of the conversations and the networks. And the trade.
Does that in his performances a little bit, doesn't he? Some of those,
the lecture performances.
Yeah, the lecture performances. That's where some of those connections come out. Those unexpected, or not unexpected, but the connections that we're not aware of.
Yes. Well, the Walid Rad lecture performances are his earliest work. He still does them sometimes, but they are very much about the question of the voice and what is truthful and what is not truthful, and much is constructed.
Yeah.
in those, of course. But he does a performative element here when he illustrates all the artists that have been shrunk, and he puts himself in it, which is interesting, you know, kind of strange thing. So this is his retrospective. I mean, these are all, for example, this might be a monitor embedded in there, a little one like this, with an earlier work, and these are all his works, the work that was in Documenta in many years ago, the work about the car bombs in Lebanon and so. So that's a case of self-shrinking, so withdrawing through scale. But it's not a primary element of, I cannot say that there are many works, to answer your question, about reduction of scale in Documenta. This might, in our document, this might be the only one. I mean, this question of the reduction of scale, the use of the model, was very important in the 80s when Thomas Schütte was working and a number of artists were working on this reduction of scale in the model. I think in the Documenta there were a lot of small scale things, which has to do with, let's look at for a second Etel Adnan's paintings. It has to do with what is overlooked, of course, but also thinking about these relationship that we have with small things in our daily lives. Also, you know, Etel Adnan's paintings are this big, these landscapes. That's a rug carpet piece. And she speaks of them as indeed things that are in the house, you know, that are like a vase. So that's her palette knife that was in the brain next to the small objects that had been destroyed during the Lebanese wars in the museum because of the museum burning. So the palette knife in the brain referred to her paintings that were then in the Documenta Halle. So there were a lot of small objects, but they weren't shrunk, except for Validrad's thing.
It kind of, I was wondering, because at some point you had said that the Documenta is exactly not in the tradition of the, the big world's fairs and the world's exhibitions, which would have made the shrinking example be a kind of a classical example of the world as exhibition, you know, that used to
Yes.
be the 19th century model of, you
Yes.
know, let's convene the world and,
Yes.
wherever it was in France or in England or in America.
Yes.
But then you said it's much more in the tradition of the Wunderkabinette.
Yes.
Right, and those are your examples.
Yes,
you know,
the
that
cabinet,
you've just
yes.
pointed out, the little
The
little
pre-modern,
bits that
yes.
are entangled through association and through personal stories. Yeah, they're put there rather
Yes.
than, you know, kind of.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the Cabinet of Curiosity was much more important to me as a model, but I wanted to reverse it again. It's important that the Cabinet of Curiosity is not bringing all these things into this cabinet that are small, but which still has this centripetal force to it, but to reverse it so that from the brain things would go in all directions out, not only to Kassel, but also to Kabul, to Banff, to Cairo, to Alexandria. So it was a kind of exploded Cabinet of Curiosity, but certainly not the World Fair. I hope.
No, I'm not saying that. I just,
Yeah. Anybody else would like to speak about, well, the phase right now, what we're trying to do is to discuss a little bit things that came out in the lecture yesterday from different perspectives, untease them. Then I think it's time for maybe, are we having a break, Griselda, or should, no, okay. Then we will look at Din Kuli's piece from beginning to end, since that question came up, and I think in order to answer it, we have to watch the whole thing. I mean, if you like, that's my proposal. And then we will talk about that piece, maybe right after lunch or before, and then go on. So let's now try
I might need some help from some of the experts around, but what I was really thinking about last night and this morning was this idea of the ontology of the actual artwork in relationship and to witnessing. in relationship to the curator and the artist, because as an artist who's kind of been thrust into trying to think about being a curator, there's an interesting thing about like the idea of trauma and witnessing that the interviewer and the interviewee are both kind of witnessing that event at the same time. They're both discovering it at the same time. It's not like one's passive and one's active.
In what case? Excuse me.
I'm just thinking in terms of, for instance, like in terms of like Holocaust testimony, or I'm thinking of, is it Dory Laub? Who wrote this text about the kind of listener and the teller, like. It's actually happening there in that room, and it's as new for the teller as it is for the listener. And I'm thinking about, in terms of the Frances Elise and some of the work she was showing, that especially, I mean, this is true to all artworks, but especially in terms of documenta, in terms of a lot of new commissions, site-specific works, that the artist is kind of discovering the work as it's happening at the same time the curator, and there's a kind of interesting relationship between the curator and the artist, which is different. And I think quite interesting in terms of, especially when you're showing fragments of the Elise work, that's actually a work that's not even, I mean, I imagine Elise doesn't even know what's going on with it.
The piece he's making now,
yeah,
about the doing and undoing of the
doing
gun.
and undoing. But to me, that was also a metaphor for actually the ontology of the artwork, the work being made in front of the eyes of the curator, the audience, the artist. I don't exactly know what my question is, but it's just this idea of the artwork actually coming into being, and the kind of the
what we are witnessing, the witnessing of the art.
Yeah, the artist and the curator both witnessing that, and
that's so fascinating. But I have an allergy to the word curator, as you know.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I'm drafting the Istanbul. Yeah, I'm not curating. I mean, I think that word is really.
You are involved though.
Yeah, I mean, very involved. But words are very important. I mean, that's what like Malcolm X taught us, like first page of his autobiography or whatever. I mean, words are really important, and that word curator is almost unusable right now because it's so much to do with control and power and selection processes and distancing the funding from the artistic research, and so organizing cognitive labor. It's basically organizers of the products of cognitive labor for knowledge capitalism. So I don't particularly use it, but people do use it, and if they mean by that the forms of curatorial imagination, I mean, you can put it in a kind of. Well, I haven't even answered. I mean, I can't even answer. I don't know what to answer. But I'm just. If you take that word out of your question, and you put something else in, whatever you want to call it, like the person who's organizing the exhibition with the artist or whatever, the facilitator, where is that? Okay, then I think it's a wonderful question. It's really wonderful. Because we didn't discuss it. You know, the coming into the world of an artwork is really special, and it's before the exhibition of it, or it's during the exhibition of it. But if you make it into the exhibition of it, you are somehow killing that moment as well. I mean, when there's curatorial projects where, you know, the making of the artwork is the exhibition itself, that's a very trendy thing that was going on in the 90s to get out of the problem of subject-object relations and the passivity of viewing. So, let's turn the space into the artist studio. And I was very suspicious of that because it reminds me of reality TV, you know, of this, let's go see what's going on, you know, the artists making the artwork and everybody can watch it. But obviously the artist is knowing that they're doing an artwork in a space which is an exhibition space. So it can really inhibit a lot of processes, of possibilities of failures and new beginnings and changing. So so that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about this more silent, not silent, but this relationship of the witnessing of one's own practice and the doing that together. It's fascinating. I mean, I don't know what to say about it, but it's the reason why we do what we do. I mean,
Can I just pick it up? Because I think it's kind of important, people perhaps who've not read the Dory Lab to understand what he was trying to deal with. And it relates extremely to your lecture yesterday about the difference between the concept of the witness and then the testis who becomes the testimony. So he's talking in the context of the idea of founding this archive to ask Holocaust survivors to speak. And he is a child survivor himself, and then is a psychoanalyst. So he begins to talk about what it actually is, the process. And I use this when, with my own students when we start to study the Holocaust or any other event, because I say, who are you going to be at this point? You can be a voyeur, you can be a distanced watcher, etc. But who are you going to be at the point at which you expose yourself to something that cannot be confined to being, the possession of the person who had the experience, precisely because the trauma hasn't yet happened qua experience. The event has happened to the person who was suddenly thrust into these appalling situations, but in some sense the theory of trauma is because it overwhelms the cognitive apparatus, it hasn't yet happened, it hasn't entered into the memory bank. So it exists as these shards, this affect, these anxieties, these almost literal moments at which the as they think now, the affect on the brain, the chemical impact of shock on the brain just keeps discharging, but it doesn't get processed.
Yes.
So what
Elaborate.
they discovered was that although these people had apparently stories to tell, they didn't yet have a story. The story had to come, but the story could only come in the presence of this, almost in a sense, this testis, this third party, Dory Laub. They were not just saying, this is what happened to me. It only happened as a witnessing in the other witnessing by the interviewer.
Yes.
And then, of course, he said, but all sorts of things happen because the interviewer may not be able to bear this, or the interviewer may flood the person who's testifying, who's speaking their story with their own affectivity, or they may suddenly think, oh, that's terribly interesting, become historical and try to contain the anxiety by control. So we've got all these different kinds of affective positions that the co-witness is there. And that's why when he says it was an event without a witness, horror or terror and trauma is where things happen, but there is no one there to enable you to stand outside yourself and stand with them to say, yeah, this was a terrible thing. Somebody did awful things to me. You are yourself assaulted and violated by the event, but you can't distance yourself from it. So the process of testifying with another produces this particularly this is the testimonial moment. And it is traumatic because it can traumatize, again, the person who's attempting to give voice to something that has not yet been voiceable, and equally it can traumatize the person who is sharing this journey with the person who is required to be there. So in a sense, this is another element. It's not just a kind of, I was there, it happened, and I saw it, or the person can tell the story. Yet in fact, the deeply traumatic isn't tellable. It's lived, it's born. And the moment of trying to give it a form can either, as I've argued, be transformative if it finds a form that is a bit about holding, but it's transforming, which involves a form that transforms, but it also is the trans of the connection, the sharing, the moment of, mutual fragilizing. And if it doesn't, it may, be deadly again. I mean, it's an extremely dangerous situation. So I think I'm interested in what you're saying. One sense is not that the artwork is itself horrifyingly traumatic, but it in a sense is, I think, always somewhat traumatic to the artist, because it's this shock of the thing that you're compelled to give a form to without necessarily knowing what it is. But it's also the invitation to the viewer is not to be in a kind of crude relational aesthetic sort of way, the necessary place, but it's the witness. You know, what you introduced, that the witness become witness becomes the moment where there's another person willing to be party to the process of its being itself. Not, it's definitely there, somebody's definitely made something, there's definitely somebody come to the exhibition, but when it actually works, it's something closer to, I think, what Laub was trying to pick up, which is in itself an event, but then becomes a co-event.
Yes, but you are saying then, Griselda and Sam, that the curator, what you call the curator, would be this holding factor, the person who is creating the situation within which this story can become a story. That trauma can be elaborated and can be told. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying
not the visitor.
The unknowing of what it is shared by like the curator and the artist, and then also what because I was saying in terms of this latency of like actually you know, it's happened, I've made it, I've put it there, but actually, you know, that I don't really know what it is and what's going on. But a few months ago, you asked me about the a prioris of what an art object or an artwork is, and it's taken me a while to figure it out. But I think one of these things that just Griselda was saying is my a priori of what an artwork is, and it is something to do with that when the audience is there and when it's kind of being discovered or co-witnessed or co-authored, that's vital. That when it's just in my studio and I've kind of like thinking, okay, I think it's done, it's not actually an artwork.
Mm-hmm. But the crucial thing, to go back to what Carol was saying, it's no one, by virtue of any authority or activity, is the one. It's entirely provisional. Who, as it were, steps and takes on this. So it's not, in a sense, the audience, because it may be 95% of the audience don't get it, right? But it's the question of it being itself when somebody steps into that place. Now, it seems to me what you're trying to say about not being a curator as a profession or an organizer, etc., but the process by means of which these multiple facilitations occur that generate artworks but also make the latency become potentially effective in certain spaces requires acute attention to the processes. So it seems to be something to do with what you're saying about your work is not curating in that sense, but it does
It's a question of vocabulary also. It's not curating in the sense, we shouldn't go back to that criticism of the word. It's not necessary. It doesn't bring us forward, I think. No, I'm trying to understand if what you are saying, Sam is bringing up the curator because he's bringing up the question of this relationship between these two people, or many people, depends if it's a group of curatorial group or artistic collective, who are before the artwork exists, in the moment in which the artwork is being thought about and initiated. And what is that co-emergence or co-witnessing that is occurring? So it's not the question of the audience in front of an exhibition in a canonical space of art or in a non-canonical public space or whatever, but it's this other relationship that he wants to bring in. And I thought that that was why you were bringing up the, let's say, the analyst who listens and who doesn't only listen but creates this holding environment within which that trauma can actually be transformed into a story. So I thought that that analyst figure, let's call that person, which could also not be an analyst, is this curator figure. And you were trying to ask me about the relationship of these two forms of witnessing. The witnessing of the world that the artist is doing, performing, the witnessing of the artist telling or transforming that into a story. the witnessing that this curator is living, experiencing. Is that what you were both trying to ask? I mean, is that?
I think the complexity to me comes to trying to pin down whether it's the, whether it's the curator person or the artist person or.
Excuse me. Sorry.
To me, the complexity is when you're trying to pin down the roles, and maybe that's kind of quite an interesting conversation. But I think, because I think there's a bit of fluidity between the curator and the artist at that stage that you're describing, because I think they're both kind of figuring it out.
Well, I mean, to be very simple, in my experience, there's a big difference. I mean, I believe strongly in not being particularly a co-creator at the beginning. I mean, it has to be really an artist.
Not in terms of creation, in terms of the witnessing, I mean.
Well, maybe we need artists to answer.
I can see a thought forming here.
Well, I am thinking that there have been big discussions with curators, usually museum curators rather than art gallery curators, before the making. And then I would try, if possible, to avoid a conversation during the making, but I will put out updates. And then a lot of talking before the work is exhibited, but after the work is finished. And that's very exciting, because all sorts of things then you see that you couldn't see, or you even feel that you couldn't feel while you were in it, happen because of those conversations with the person that you had those conversations with before you started it. But to witness its making and its failure, its constant failure, is too difficult, because the facilitator, the curator, would try to help you make it succeed.
It would be a disaster.
And it would be terrible.
To be honest, it would be a disaster.
Yes.
I agree. I mean, I agree, because I just don't have the imagination. And it's not.
I think we've lost the plot here.
We lost the plot.
So, I think what you've said is very, very valuable. But I don't think, my understanding what Sam is saying is it's more a reflection back as to how we understand, through your notion of witnessing, some of these particular transactions and processes. So it's not the concreteness of any person who's helping an exhibition to come into being interfering in the work of art making.
No,
but the sense is, what you said, Sam, is the crucial thing, which is that there's a certain latency, rather like a latent, image in a photograph, right? Between something has been done, something has had an impact, something's made things, and what enables it. I suppose, in a sense, what the model with the Dory Laub is, that these things, that there needs to be somebody else there, right? That's this other witnessing. So there's just as the model of the Holocaust, there's the primary person who had the event, but they don't necessarily know what it was, but they have had it, right? Okay, one sense, but that's not the same as art. Art isn't unknown to the person who planned it and think about it, etc. So it's not a good analogy. But in some sense, it's the testimony isn't just the person saying, this is what happened to me. It's saying it in the presence of another who is prepared to be present when that is said. So it's not pretending that the the testimony becomes, they don't co-create, but in a sense it requires this other presence.
Yes, this is
And that,
interesting.
I think, could be,
This is
in
what
some
I
cases,
understood. Is in the initial
person
moment.
who then helps it in the studio, sort of fostering it, not actually intervening, which you're saying, but it's not just the idea of the solitary artist creates out of themselves, and then the object comes out of the studio and self-sufficiently.
No. This is what I understood. So in this creating of a kind of holding environment, at the beginning it's very it's intense. What you're talking about concerning the discussions at the beginning, before the concept of the artwork appears, before the emergence of what the artist says, I'm going to do this. There's a very, very intense shared moments. That's true. When one is in front of this absolute not knowing, and there is a relationship that is built often that has to do with how much one puts oneself on the line also, as a so-called curator, is how important is it to you? How can you bear witness to that space that you're offering, or that topic that you're thinking about, or that, like when I speak about the line and the underwater and the depth, if that is in terms of Istanbul, and I'm talking about, if I can say, but this has to do with all of us, it's important because everybody's touching this surface and nobody knows where the folders are anymore. And what is underneath the Bosphorus? What is underneath the ground? These miners have died down there. It's not a place for humans to be. I'm saying something completely vague, but it is often the intensity of that communication, of that it's meaningful. Then the artist sometimes will say, okay, well, this is like a kind of a audience for me, in a way. I mean, this is a person who is saying, look at this place, this problem, this question, the burning of the houses in Korea. It's important to that person. I'm going to... So the artist is witnessing this moment that the curator is putting out at the beginning. And when it's deeper, when it's not just about, well, I have this money to give you to make an artwork and so on and so forth, and we want to buy something for the collection of this person that I'm an advisor of, they walk out and it's like dying. It's like dying because one is always without, everyone is always so empty. So you feel like, what can I do to perform on this stage? I can do nothing. But if you have a person in front of you who is moved and bears testimony of that being moved by something, then all the more intensely the artist usually will go off and come up with a completely autonomous, but it's a reaction also, and will test it with you. They will look, and see, like, I have this idea, I might do this and that, and what do you think? And according to how this relationship goes, then there's the separation, at least in my experience, that you're talking about, and the whole thing proceeds. So there is a witnessing each other. It's this holding figure. Basically what he's asking about is not the experience of the traumatized who needs to, but it's that person who is going to listen and hold. What is going on in that? What brings Dory Laub to be a psychoanalyst, and what is that experience? Can one bear witness to that? Or should one? It's an ethical question. In fact, the psychoanalysts shouldn't. They don't go around and start blah, blah, blah about all their patients. And so it's a very interesting silent witness, not silent witness as in technology, but as sort of a witness, the role of which is to never bear witness. There are things that I will never say, for example, about moments when an artist, there are moments when, I can't say them, so there you go. But
I felt uncomfortable when I saw the Elise images, and he's figuring this out.
Figuring what out?
The work.
Oh, you mean the new work?
Yeah. And actually I was thinking, okay, but this is an educational context, this is of interest to us. But there is that
But
aspect.
that's not okay. Don't worry about that.
No,
because
I'm not
those
worried
are
about it, but,
pictures. No, those are pictures he's publishing in a book that's coming out with the show.
But there is this. Anyway, I don't need to talk anymore. But,
No, you do. And I understand this uncomfortableness. And what I've learned from this is that there's a similarity between my reluctance to speak about the curator and the curatorial and blah, 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 and the psychoanalyst's kind of ethical code of shutting up and not saying, oh, and then so-and-so resolved this and that and understood this and that and was able to tell this and that story. So there is this position of the witness who will never testify and cannot testify because it is absurd to take
I just want to clarify one more thing, because for the long purposes of the tape in this thing, which is the fact that Dory Laub was a psychoanalyst doesn't mean that that's the position he observed. So he wasn't in an analytical relation, okay? So it's quite important. So it's not, the Winnicottian holding that we're talking about here. But it's much closer to what you've just suggested, but it's that question of there being that there's a necessary human other who shares the journey, not without confusing whose journey it is.
Yes.
That enables something to enter into a communicable form by the as it were, it's more the solicitation to do it, or I keep thinking in Bracher in terms of it's the seduction into life, not pretending that you are the better parent and can hold this or help any. There's no cure here, because there's no question that the outcome has any destiny, right? What it could include, going back to Lubanus, it could actually be a learning through failing or be very difficult. But therefore it's not. Dory Laub's account of the process of what it is that he's learnt that testimony is that it requires the partnership with something in the world to sort of share the journey without confusing, but it is a presence that makes the possibility of it happening. So whether you imagine in your studio there's someone out there who wants to see this work, or there's someone with whom who might understand what I'm doing, or might even be there even though I don't understand. In some sense, this is maybe an imaginary figure, it's a virtual figure. In some circumstances, for this testimonial project, they discovered something nobody ever knew before about what it was and what it needed. So it wasn't that they needed an analyst; they needed, a partner.
Yes.
Yeah, in some sort of sense. But I think that's what I understood you to be evoking, this set of gestures, right?
But that is
and that
really,
allows the work to...
Yes, it's very interesting. It's really about the essentials of language. How can one speak if there is no... It becomes a cry, And then if there is... But this is beyond the human. It's beyond the human. The language implies that there's some sort of an listener.
Well, maybe it links up with your first one. What I'm going to say now is perhaps we do need to have a little sit-about break and then move into watching the
video.
But I think just to remind some people who came in late, but we've been basically exploring the question that Carolyn put forward, which was why did she give the lecture on withdrawing and witnessing, which seemed to be moving back towards focusing on human experience in some kind of
privileged and direct way, when all the rest of the work has been about moving out of this privilege.
But it may be that this would come right with the way back to the point that in some sense where we've got to is whatever this other that is implied or invoked or become sort of discovery is sort of kind of a hope. It's partly to do with the hope that there is someone somewhere else there who will find some purpose in it, that this can be something other than a human.
Yes, exactly, like horizontal gene transfer.
Oh, which brings you back to Donna Haraway even.
Yes, yes. Could
Especially
you
in her
say,
dogs.
please explain what you're saying?
Wolf, yes. I mean, it goes back to Donna Haraway and her relationship with her dogs when she's doing the, it's not dog training, it's the, what does she call it? Where the dog goes through all the hoops and,
The exercise.
I mean, it's that relationship. Sorry?
Agility.
Agility tests. I mean, that seems to me to be a really, really beautiful example of a non-human response to not just instructions, but to the presence of the person giving the instructions, or the
I would
the
say
partner.
that the question is not non-human. Again, that's a little bit, it's very slight use of terms, but that change the universe.
Yeah.
Dogs are not non-human.
No, okay.
Humans
no,
are
because we
not
share
non-dogs.
No, because we share the the genes, which is also
there's
what
horizontal
Haraway
gene
says.
transfer, which
Yep.
we now know more and more of,
Yep.
that the history of evolution was not Darwinian plus Darwin's thinking of these mistakes that occasionally occurred inexplicably. No, there's all this horizontal stuff, things that come from millions of years ago, shared ancestors, and yet millions of years down the line, they will have a horizontal gene transfer. Flowers that don't have stem and so on. So this is more and more like the post-Lynn Margulis way of thinking about these coevolution that goes on all the time, not in a lab of a scientist, it just happens. Because organisms tend to aggregate and share and become more complex organisms and so on. So yes, I just wouldn't use the word non-human. It's always a question of co-emergence and interacting through which the entities also appear. Now, if one looks at the curator-artist thing that way, it's even more complicated because certainly you can see how the curator only emerges through the co-emergence. If there's no art, there can't be a curator, obviously. I mean, that doesn't exist. It's impossible. So that you can see, but the question of, and probably the artist without this other, whether the other is part of oneself or on the edge of oneself or one's foot, the brain being throughout the whole body and so on, these others within us and so on and without, is a question. But if you take this idea of interaction and co-emergence, then this autonomy also of the artistic figure is more questioned. But in fact, in the Dinkuli that we're going to see, I don't know, with him, that's why I wanted to publish the notebook, and I gave you the readings, the interview with him. We don't know exactly where is the definition and boundary between the curatorial practice and the artistic practice. Who's the author of that? Who are the artists? I don't know. I mean, surely many of the artists are the artists who are being interviewed, and the artworks exhibited were by those artists. And he was a curatorial project by an artist. But at the same time, they knew that we had to decide the font size for their names in the notebook and in the list of artists. They knew that they were part of a project that was initiated by this artist. So his name in the catalog, and then in parentheses, the artists that are part of this exhibition that he made, which is also an artwork. And so even in that situation, there are Russian dolls in the whole thing, and it's complicated to say what is the artwork. Surely that video could be the artwork, but maybe not. Maybe the video is just a documentary supporting the exhibition of these drawings.